during the time as we go. First of all, welcome to the Human Rights Impact Assessment in Practice seminar organized by HRIA Sweden. We have a great list of speakers here. Tim Gore from Oxfam, Nina Elomaa from S Group, Jean-René Bologno from the Italian trade union FLAI, and Hanna, Sutherlin, Sustainability Manager at Systembolaget. This is a really great panel as well, because it's a multi-stakeholder panel, which is what ETI Sweden is all about. Bringing together stakeholders, trade unions, companies, NGOs, civil society organizations to work on securing human rights in global supply chains. Now, seminars like this will be open for everyone to join, but what ETI really is about and what we want to do is to actually work with our members on improving methods of securing human rights in supply chain. So we will be working in the supply chain together with our members, companies, trade unions, etc., to create real change and also improve the way we are working with global supply chain right now. Obviously, this is not about ETI today, but you're welcome to contact us to know more about what we do after the seminar. So to get started from the basics, what is human rights impact assessment, and also hear more about what Oxfam has done in this area, and learn more about it before we hear from the other stakeholder, I pass the word to Tim.
Thanks, Henrik. Thanks for having us. Thanks for convening this session. I'm going to share my screen.
So if you can share your screen, Tim.
It's coming. Okay. Can you see it okay?
Great. You're ready to go.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thanks so much for having us. So yeah, as Henrik says, well, I'm Tim Gore. I'm from Oxfam. I'm head of policy and research for our work on food justice, climate change, land rights, etc. And I've been involved in some of our human rights impact assessment work in the supply chains of major food companies. So in this presentation, I will give a quick overview as to what a human rights impact assessment is, how it relates to processes of human rights due diligence. And then we're going to dive into the particular example of the work we did with the Finnish S Group on their processed tomato supply chain from Italy. And I'm just going to pick out 3 aspects which are particularly important in the process that we went through. And then, of course, very much looking forward to hearing from some of the other key stakeholders in that process. So what is a human rights impact assessment? The first thing, of course, won't be news, I hope, to anybody joining this webinar, but human rights violations are widespread in food value chains, as in many other commodity value chains. And these are a package of materials that Oxfam has published in recent years, which really document at some length those human rights violations. And I think what is also commonly understood now within the sector is the need to move beyond audits, the traditional use of social audits that have very serious limitations. Of course, the Rana Plaza example is a very pertinent one, where the factories that were involved in that disaster had actually passed 4 BSCI audits in the weeks just before the disaster. So what's wrong with audits? They're really a box ticking approach. There's not meaningful work or community engagement. They don't try to identify the root causes of problems, even if they find those problems. They encourage this compliance mentality where the pressure is put onto suppliers rather than looking at systemic, structural, long-term drivers of human rights risks. So they still have a place. They're certainly scalable. They're easy. Big companies know how to work with them. They have a place, but only as part, we would say, of a much wider human rights due diligence approach. So the shift that we think that companies need to go through is from thinking about how issues in their supply chains pose risks to them as a company, to instead considering the risks to human rights. And that really is embodied in the UN Guiding Principles, which have these 3 pillars. And will, of course, the work that we're talking about today falls primarily under the 2nd pillar, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, which applies to all companies everywhere. And it also refers not just to your own operations as a company, but also to things that happen in your supply chain, whether you are causing those human rights violations, you contribute to them, or you are linked to those violations, has a bearing on your responsibilities as a company. This is a depiction then of what those requirements mean for companies, a policy commitment to respecting human rights, but also this human rights due diligence process, which has various aspects, and they're depicted in this diagram. But really at the heart is this process of assessing both actual and potential risks to human rights, and to take action to prevent or mitigate those risks. And that really is at the core of the purpose of a human rights impact assessment. We need various tools to help us to do that, but a human rights impact assessment is one of the tools that you can use to help you to understand actual and potential human rights impacts, and to identify the actions you need to take to prevent or mitigate them. And so, we could compare, therefore, the difference between a human rights impact assessment in that regard to your traditional social audits. So this is a process which is much more in-depth, it's multi-dimensional, it should be independent, delivered independently of the company. Even if it's commissioned by the company, it should be the process should be independent of the company. We would say it should address all stages of the value chain, not just look at what's going on at the level of suppliers, but look at the full value chain. Rather than just being a checking process against a code of conduct, it should really be a more analytical, a reflective process, and it should look at the full range of potential and actual human rights impacts. Rather than just being a question of the auditor making judgments, it's really about grounding the analysis in the views of rights holders. Participation absolutely critical in impact assessment processes. And I think for us as well, the important thing here is that you're not just looking to identify what are the problems, but to really ask why. And to get to those root causes, because out of that you can develop the recommendations, which should be not just about what suppliers need to do, but also what companies themselves need to do, and other stakeholders, notably governments or others that might have a bearing on these risks. And of course, this is increasingly a new industry benchmark. There are a number of companies that are already using human rights impact assessments. Nestlé was one of the first to do very in-depth assessments together with the Danish Institute on Human Rights, but a number of others, S Group, of course. Albert Heijn in the Netherlands has committed to conducting a number of these now, some other supermarkets following suit, Lavazza, a variety of companies in the food sector alone. And I think the other thing to stress is that while this has been essentially a voluntary approach, it is rapidly becoming a mandatory requirement, whether at the EU level or at national level, including here in Sweden and several other European member states. Mandatory legislation requiring companies to conduct human rights due diligence is on its way, and it's only a matter of time before this will become a requirement of all companies. So let's dive into the example of what we did with the S Group in Finland, looking at their processed tomato supply chain from Italy. That's the paper. The full paper is quite long. There is an executive summary, or if you just want to get a sense of the headline findings, there's also a blog which tries to capture that at that link. What were we trying to do? The objective was to assess the actual and potential human rights impacts in S Group's Italian processed tomato supply chain, to identify their root causes and make recommendations. From the outset, it was important, I'm sure we'll hear more from Nina about this, but from the outset, it was important for S Group to find a model of conducting these types of assessments that was scalable, that was relevant, that was appropriate to their business, where you have 30,000 or so separate product supply chains, huge complexity. How can you find a model of conducting a more in-depth assessment that goes beyond what you can do with a social audit, but nonetheless gives you results in a time frame and for a cost, frankly, that is scalable and could become part of a regular due diligence process. So we tried to do this in around 6 months, and we had to make various choices about focusing the scope of the assessment in order to do that. So we looked just at workers at the production stage of the supply chain only, because that's where we identified the risks were highest. And as I'll explain in a moment, we built a sample which focused on 2 main suppliers in most depth, and our recommendations were really focused just at S Group, although they also were related to what other actors needed to do. And we go through a process with these 5 phases that I'll talk through now. So this is how we do it as Oxfam. There are other approaches. They all amount to pretty much the same sort of thing. But we go through a process first of context analysis, building the understanding of the value chain. And you can do that with literature reviews and with a first round of interviews with your key stakeholders, reviewing documents, policy documents, and so on. Then there's a process of mapping the human rights impacts in the supply chain. This is where you need to be doing rights holder interviews on the ground, often working with local trade unions or other local organizations. And Oxfam was very proud to work together with CGIL Fly, and we're going to hear from them later, of course, in order to conduct those interviews, and with a number of other stakeholders in the sector in order to facilitate access to workers. Then I think very important for us is that we have a process of root cause analysis, of prioritizing those different risks that have been identified and building recommendations. And this is key because even if you've tried to focus the assessment, you still end up with an almost overwhelming amount of information, a huge number of potential or actual risks that may have been identified. And so what do you do with that as a company? You need to have a rigorous process to go through to prioritize those risks, to build your understanding of the root causes, and to really pick your recommended actions based on that. We then go through a validation process before finalizing, communicating, publishing, making everything public. That's all a very important part of the due diligence process, to be public about the findings and what you're going to do about it. So let me just dip into these 3 important aspects. There are many, of course, but I'll just pick on these 3 aspects that I think are some of the issues that come up for companies that are considering conducting impact assessments themselves. So the first is, we would say, to take an approach which looks at the full supply chain, but then within that, focus down and build a manageable sample to help you to make sense of it. So first, understand the value chain. This is a typical processed tomato value chain from Italy. And the key here is not, for us, is not just to understand who are the actors, but what are the power relationships between those actors. And so think about the level of market concentration at different points in the supply chain. Think about what that means for the price setting mechanisms at different points in the supply chain. And this really is typical of food value chains all around the world, that you get very high market concentration at the retail end, increasingly concentrated markets at the processing stage, and then generally very highly fragmented markets at the production stage. So you get tens of thousands of workers, thousands of producers, around 100 now of these processing companies in Italy, but really there are 5 or 6 very big ones now that dominate the market. And in most European countries, just a handful of food retailers. So if you want to be selling into those markets, you have to pass through that very concentrated channel. Also, and I should say that to develop that understanding, you can do that with literature reviews, but you can also really do that with your first round of interviews with stakeholders in the company and others, so that you can really try and understand the industry context. Then you want to understand the labor context in the sourcing country. Again, you can do this with literature reviews. You can do this with interviews, with the first round of interviews with key stakeholders. This is a great map from CGIL Fly. I'm sure Jean-René is going to talk more about some of this. This maps the labor, migrant labor flows in the agriculture sector in the south of Italy in a particular season. And as the trade unions there have shown, there are very high risks of labor exploitation within the migrant agricultural worker labor force in particular in Italy. So something around 16% of migrants having an informal working relationship, maybe 30–40% earning below rates set in the collective bargaining agreements, for example. So this gives us an understanding of the kind of context that we're looking at. Then we need to focus in on the company-specific supply chains that we're looking at. And although we're just looking at one product, processed tomatoes, of course, there are many forms of processed tomato product. And for a company like S Group, there were several different supply chains for the brand, the premium brand products, supply chains for their own label, private label products, also a separate supply chain for their restaurant business. So we have to first map that and understand, is this similar? Is this typical of the overall industry picture that we looked at previously? And certainly in the case of S Group, yes, it was. This is a very typical supply chain, increasing market concentration as you move down the chain. And from that, then we need to start to build a sample, because obviously we can't try and assess everything that is going on at every stage in that chain. You could do it, but you could write your PhD thesis on it. You could take years and years, and of course that doesn't deliver meaningful information for companies. So how do we start to build a sample? So we broke this out in terms of those three main types of supply chains: the private label, the brand, and the restaurant. And we looked at the list of suppliers, we looked at their sourcing regions, and ultimately we decided to focus on two companies in particular for the most in-depth part of the assessment, Ladoria and Mutti. These are two of the biggest tomato processing companies in Italy. So they're really big players. They were the longest standing suppliers in the S Group assortment. So they've been supplying to S Group for many, many years. They cut across all three types of the supply chain, and they were both sourcing from what we identified to be one of the highest risk regions in the country, Apulia. So that's why we decided to focus in particular there. We did conduct interviews with others, but that was how we chose to focus in and achieve something meaningful in the time constraints that we had. So I guess my first message is that a focused but scalable approach is possible, even with these very in-depth assessment processes. So we did that by choosing one region, Puglia, two suppliers to look at in depth. We conducted about 30 rights holder interviews in the sector. I would say that's about the minimum that you should be thinking. And that was really only possible to have a number like that because there's so much that is known about labor exploitation in the tomato industry in Italy. I mean, many reports, many media investigations that have been published in recent years. So we didn't want to spend too much resource and time reiterating. We wanted to have a check. Are the same sorts of issues still prevalent? Have they changed at all? So in that sense, with this context, we could get away with a smaller number of worker interviews. If there's much less known about the context, I would say you will need to have a much larger sample size of rights holder interviews. We also, another good tip, we used this multi-stakeholder roundtable, which we hosted in Rome, which was another sort of very efficient way of getting inputs from a wide range of stakeholders without having to have lots and lots of separate interviews. One day, get everyone in one room, and you get a really rich discussion and get lots of very important inputs. You can also use that as part of your validation as well of your early results. Second important aspect then is to prioritize all of the information that you're going to get from that process and to conduct a root cause analysis based on it. Because you will get, even if you focus, you will get a huge amount of information, a huge number of potential human rights risks, and you've got to try and boil that down and make it useful information for the company, actionable information for the company. So we go through this process of identifying, prioritizing, and the UNGPs are clear. You should prioritize based on where the risks are most severe. So in this case, some of the most severe risks included in relation to the accommodation, many workers housed in what are known in Italy as ghettos, so informal housing for workers in the countryside, usually without access to reliable electricity or running water. These are unsafe, often unsanitary housing. I'm sure we'll hear more about this. Unsafe transport to the farms, a major problem in the sector. Workers being taken in essentially minivans that are not really roadworthy often. And every year there are accidents with involving these vans that are carrying workers. Just in the course of the assessment that we conducted, there were several deaths on the roads just in that period. And then a further one around the lack of access to drinking water, sun shelters, protective equipment on the farms. And again, there are many cases of workers that have died in the sector, in the agriculture sector in Italy as a whole, through often through being exposed. You remember, this is in the heat of the Italian summer in the south, working many long hours, backbreaking work, and of course the health risks that poses to workers is extremely high. So these were some of the most severe impacts. Similarly, of course, we looked at wage rates. We found the majority of workers almost certainly being paid less than the rates in the negotiated collective bargaining agreements and working excessive hours. I think what's very important for us is that our finding was that these conditions were irrespective of whether or not workers had a formal contract, and they were irrespective of their form of recruitment. So there have been a lot of focus in recent years on the role of the caporale, the informal labor brokers in the sector, but it seemed to us that actually this didn't seem to be the driving determinant of wage rates in the sector. It was much more of a structural problem that all workers were being paid more or less the same. And this what is known as grey labour practices becoming increasingly widespread. So no longer the case that workers were being employed without formal contracts. Now they had contracts, but nonetheless, the conditions in those contracts were not being respected. Widespread fraud, essentially, in the sector. And that shows, again, the limits of a traditional audit or self-assessment questionnaire approach, because they will not get to the bottom of those problems, because there is a list of there are contracts held by farmers. They have a list of workers, they have payroll. If that's all you check, you won't get to the bottom of of what is really going on in the sector, where there is, as I say, this sort of widespread fraud. And then we think it's very important to assess the root causes of these problems. So you need to be mapping the underlying drivers. We use a sort of a political economy approach. We look at two types of root causes, those around the supply of labor in Italy that is highly vulnerable to exploitation, and around the demand for cheap labor in the sector. So you know, there are a number of causes, and I'm just going to pick out a couple here that we looked at in more detail, which were around the purchasing practices of retailers like S Group. So it's not to say that's the only thing that matters, but you need to have this full mapping of the underlying drivers, so that also you can understand which of those, or on which of those does the company have the most leverage. How can we make the biggest difference? Because actually, arguably, a company is going to have very limited impact over some of these factors, but can do more about others, and their own purchasing practices, their own business practices are an important part of that. So we looked at the price dynamics in the chain. We identified that while there should have been an increase in the labor cost during the previous 5 years, because the collective bargaining agreement on wages had increased the wage rates by about 8% in real terms over this period. At the same time, prices were being squeezed, the prices being paid by the retailers to the processors were being squeezed about between 15 and 25% in real terms over those 5 years. And similarly, the real term prices being paid from the processors to the producers was also being squeezed. So it seems to us that there is this disconnect between price setting downstream in the chain and the labor costs of production. And so that was a very important part of our assessment, to look at how prices are being set, how purchasing is being conducted, and to understand how that could be linked, how that could be contributing to an increased risk of human rights violations in the sector. So my final points then are just about the importance of publishing a time-bound action plan in response to the findings and the recommendations of a process like this, and to encourage these ripple effects. I think one of the things that we have found is that a process like this, it is a big commitment, it is a big investment from a company, but you get a lot of benefits or a lot of impact beyond just the results on the particular supply chain. There are all of these ripple effects. You can use the process to build new partnerships, to engage new actors. You see all sorts of dynamics that are kicking off. I mean, we did this 2 years ago and we're still having webinars about it now, which suggests just how important or how the range of impacts that the processes themselves can take. And I think you should see it in that way. You should encourage those types of more systemic outcomes. When you're thinking about the action plan, the key, one of the keys is to consider the company's relationship to the different impacts that have been identified. In the language of the UNGPs, this means you need to determine whether or not the company causes the particular violation, whether it contributes to them, or whether it's directly linked to them. And this is a slightly, difficult question, and it's one that I think, we're still, as a sector, going through understanding how to differentiate whether the company causes or contributes to particular impacts, but very important because it has different implications in terms of the responsibilities of the company. But finally, I'll just sum up with what happened as a result of or some of what happened as a result of this work. So there have been, I think, some really significant changes in the policies and practices of S Group as a result. I won't run through all of those because I know we're going to hear from Nina and I don't want to take up too much time, but I think, they made some very serious commitments. It's a couple of years on now, so it will be really good to understand how the company has changed some things as a result. That we've also seen very important changes at some of their key suppliers. So we understand now that there is drinking water available. They've made revisions to their own codes of conduct. They are beginning processes, discussions to think about how prices are set. But as I said as well, there's a whole range of, I would say, wider sectoral initiatives that have grown up off the back of this work. We have helped investors, including a large group of Nordic investors, with a fact-finding trip to Italy to understand this sector as an example of human rights risks in food supply chains. There's been a whole range of these types of webinars. So it's really sparked interest, I would say, more widely across the sector. We've engaged buying groups as well to think through their purchasing practices. So as I said, I think, the value of these types of processes go beyond just the identification of the particular impacts and actions you can take. They do have this sort of potential to force a more reflective discussion within the company and across sector with your peers as well. And I think that's, really important to sort of bear in mind when you set out. It seems daunting, but you can get a lot of bang for your buck. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot, Tim, for that intense and informative introduction of the work you've done. And I think it's a good time to pass over the word to Nina to tell us about their perspective on the human rights impact assessment that they've done and the work that they're doing. So Nina, please tell us about your work.
Okay, thank you, Henrik, and maybe just to check, Henrik, that you can see the screen and everything, and my voice is okay.
Everything is perfect. Just the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much also, Tim, for very deep and analytical approach, and I think it's easy to continue. So I will shortly tell a little bit about the kind of the findings and the topics, and maybe the kind of what did we learn about this process and how things go forward. I will not go into the detail how we work with the human rights, but of course we are committed to the UNGPs, and we are, and of course following also the OECD guidelines and doing our best on the human rights in general within S Group. So the commitment is covering all our operations, and thus I think this is the kind of the basic level approach that needs to be in place. But of course, one of the key topics is knowing then the risks in the supply chain. And we are having the processes in place for the third-party audits and the regular dialogue and surveys that we are conducting and assessing, of course, the supplier performance in general. But what we want also to note, and what was also one of the discussions when we actually started the case in Italy, and why we chose the Italy is also to understand that it's important to look close to. So the labor conditions can be also kind of, or there are adverse impacts on these topics also close to you, even in the so-called non-risk countries. And what we have recognized as well is that the topics are coming up also in Finland. For example, this summer we noted that there was a discussion about the berry pickers kind of lodging conditions and so forth. So the human rights adverse impacts are there, and there are topics that you need to consider also close to you. I want to highlight this, that we keep this in mind when we consider our evaluations also. Of course, this is a kind of the topic that Tim was also discussing. So the audits and all these normal procedures, you can reach the scalability. And then when you want to go into these in-depth analysis, there you need also the third party or the kind of, let's say, objective view, and it's good to have the collaboration with the NGOs like we had with Oxfam. So it needs to be somebody who is looking then to these topics together with you. And we decided to go for this kind of, we call it the radical transparency assessment, where we want to also learn and find the things that what we can do better, where we can improve ourselves and understand, and they're also kind of put them into the context in such a way that they could be a process that we can also follow in the future. So it's good to understand that both of these are needed. So when we are talking about the huge amount of supply chains, it's important to focus on both. So not only to the audits, but also to have then the learnings from the deeper human rights impact assessments. So the assessment in Italy. So why did we go then to Italy? There was we knew that there is a lot of vulnerable workforce available there, and there has been challenges in conducting the independent social audits. And one of the key topics was then the migrant workers at the processed tomato supply chains in South Italy. The internal discussion before we went for this case was actually that we would have conducted this type of radical transparency process in some other countries out of Europe, but we decided then that this is the case that we can also, and our sourcing function was also kind of very much recommending to look also the case in Italy. And once again, also the kind of the comment that I said earlier is that we can look close to, and there are challenges, so we shouldn't forget that. The key findings, what we found, and this was also already in the team's presentation, but the key findings that were found out in the impact assessment was the excessive working hours. And the working hours according to the collective agreement in Foggia is 6.5 hours per day. But like in the team presentation already said, this was a kind of going over quite tremendously. The daily wage was around 40 to 60 euros, and the collective agreement in Foggia says 7.85 85 euros per hour. So the wage level also a big finding for us. And then there was the recruitment challenge. So up to 40 to 50% deductions from the salaries. And this, of course, then goes for the elements of forced labor. So this was also one of the key findings. And then the poor housing conditions. So the lodging in the area was not in the condition that it needs to be. So these were one of the key findings. What we also wanted to focus on was to understand the root causes. So the understanding the root causes makes it then, of course, possible also to understand what you can do. What are the ways, and according to also to UNGPs, what are the ways that you can put your company in the position? What are the actions that you can take? The political reasons naturally are there. The weak official recruitment channels, which then of course goes also to the kind of the middlemen that are within the process and causes then these costs and then leads to the elements of forced labor. Unfortunately, also criminal activity recognized as one of the root causes, and then the international competition, which is then making and causing then the challenge to the price levels that Tim was also mentioning in his presentation. What we learned: broad approach needed. Of course, our part is then to understand where we can have the influence and what we can do. So what needs to be done is then the advocacy for legal recruitment channels and migrant workers' position. We can have a very kind of also more or less direct discussions with suppliers relating to the development of the production. And one of the things what has happened in the kind of collecting the tomatoes in the fields is that there is much more kind of now used more also safe equipment, and this has been one of the developments happening in the fields. Dialogue and training and monitoring of suppliers. We had discussions also with our partner, the Coop Trading, which is the kind of the organization that is doing the sourcing partly to us. And there has been quite a systematic approach taken into use how the training of, for example, the sourcing function is happening nowadays. So that has been one of the topics that they took very seriously from this assessment, and how they train also the sourcing function when it comes to the monitoring of the pricing and how they are doing the tendering. So this is an important part of the learnings. The international collaboration is needed because we know that these similar issues occur also in the other European countries. So it's not the only case for Italy. We know that this is a challenge, like I said, also in Finland. And the important part is then to also of course then to hear what the workers have to say, what is their kind of view. And I think my personal experience is that this is done actually better with using the third parties with whom the workers can openly or more openly discuss about the challenges and the topics related. Sometimes the supplier or the direct partner is not the right one to be able to hear the workers' voices and hear then also the kind of the challenges that they are facing. And then I want to just to say very shortly about the transparency. This is the last slide, Henrik, and the transparency is the key topic also. So we got also very much positive feedback when it comes to the transparent of and publishing the report, and I would say that this is very also recommendable approach to all. in case you do this type of studies. So thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. Now we'll go over to hear the perspective of the local trade union from Jean-René. And your trade union has also been one of the stakeholders that Oxfam talked to during this study. So you asked me to share a map for you. I'll do that. Yes. You're ready to go, Jean-René? I think you need to unmute yourself. Great.
Good morning. Let me first of all thank ATI Sweden and Oxfam for this great opportunity of confrontation and view issue of HRIA. Well, we have gone deep into the issue as far as Italy is concerned, most especially the tomatoes industry. Well, the first thing to say is that well, the issue is deeply rooted in Italy, but not the entire Italian agriculture is soiled by exploitative labor and gangmaster. Well, this map is, we published this map exactly a month back. It is part of a research we normally conduct every 2 years on exploitative labor and gangmaster in agriculture. We published reports, the report by October, and we are now publishing another. I mean, we want to add these maps to our national report. The report says that things do not really improve in Italy as far as agriculture is concerned. The report says that today we have about 180,000 vulnerable workers in agriculture. Vulnerable workers means workers living in very miserable conditions and working as well in very poor conditions. And 180 is very high number. It's a very high numbers. The causes of this situation, I think both Tim and Nina have gone deep into that. Now the really issue is how to overcome this situation. Well, in 2016 we got a very good law in Italy, law 199, against exploitative labor and gangmastering, not only in agriculture, but in every sector, And the law is divided into two parts. Now, there is a repressive part. We heard about the repressive part on a daily basis. People are being arrested on a daily basis. We hear about operations. People are jailed on a daily basis. And there is a preventive part in the same law. Well, the preventive part of the law is partially disregarded. It's because we need to have at the local level everywhere in Italy. I mean, at the district level, we need to have the network, the agricultural network for safe labor. Unfortunately, we have about 110 districts in Italy, and up to now, from 2016 to now, we have only 6 or 7 local fair labor networks, as the law says, which means some of the stakeholders don't really believe that we can act and overcome this situation. But we, as a labor union, we believe we have to go further than what we currently have, and we strongly believe that human rights impact assessment is a key issue. Human rights in terms of labor is not only linked with the salaries, with the wages. It is linked with the welfare of workers. Our top issue is the welfare of workers. We have seen the conditions, and our team showed us some of the pictures of the what we call in Italy ghettos, now informal settlements. We have tens and tens of informal settlements. Most of the 180,000 people, vulnerable workers we are talking about here, live in informal settlements, in ghettos. That's a very huge number of people living very far away from decent welfare or zero, who live in welfare zero. Well, we have to look at a series of agendas. We have agenda 2030, for instance. We have the UN guiding lines on human rights. We have a series of targets, a series of objectives we have to look at. And from our standpoint, being a labor union, we believe that HRIA are more valuable when a company or enterprise goes beyond the common assessment, as Tim said, based on audit. Now we have to go beyond, they have to go beyond that. Now they have to apply spontaneously. In such case, it sounds like authentic stakeholder engagement. Now, it is a matter of engagement. It means standing by the workers' side, standing for the workers' welfare. And workers have to really be involved into the process. And how are workers being involved in the process? Well, we are labor union, we represent workers. Now, we are elected by workers as labor union officials, officers and officials. And we can interact with whoever is really interested in human rights impact assessment. We wouldn't do that. We cannot do that. It has to be done not by an independent source. No, we cannot do that. But we can contribute. No, we must contribute to the assessment. The situation in Italy, not only in southern Italy, but it is all over Italy. I said it before. Not the entire agro-food sector in Italy is soiled by these issues, but huge parts of the agro-food sector. And well, there are other stakeholders such as the retailers Tim talked about. They play a key role in this issue. Now, we cannot look at the retailers as if they were not concerned or involved into all these issues, because they tend to take advantage. No? They tend to unduly take advantage on their suppliers. I mean, on their suppliers, and force them, they really force them to grant their product at very low prices. And obviously those very low prices reflect on the workers' condition. Well, this is what we have to say, and the human right impact is really important. Now, from here, where do we go? How do we go forward? I mean, how do we go forward? In Europe, there is a kind of we are looking at some changes. You know, the Common Agricultural Policy has now taken into consideration what they call the social condition. Now, there will be what they call the social conditionality. Every agri-food producer, agricultural producer, will now be forced, if it is adopted. For now, it is a principle. It is a guideline for now. Now, it is just a principle. But they will be forced to show that they respect human rights and workers' welfare before receiving the grants of the common agricultural policy. And I believe that is a very big achievement. It is a great achievement because in the past, the common agricultural policy used to share the European grants as if workers were not involved in no part of the process. But now with the social conditionality, we really believe if it is implemented, we can overcome this issue, because when you impact on the financial resources, now, if you impact on the financial resources, most of the stakeholders will really observe the engagement for human rights impact. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your contribution, really interesting perspective. We'll quickly move on to Hanna. As you notice, all of you listening out there, we haven't had time for questions. Don't hesitate to write questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to bring them up during our panel discussion at the end. So we haven't forgotten about questions, but just bear with us. I hope we'll come to them at the end. And now, Hanna from our ETI Sweden member company, Systembolaget, please.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to see if I can, if it looks all right to you.
You need to start your presentation in full screen mode.
And why does it not let me? Now, here we go. There we go.
Yes.
Good. So thank you so much, Henrik, for that introduction. And I will be brief on what the work that we're doing. But really the reason we're here to talk now is on the human rights impact assessment that Oxfam is currently doing for us. So we are really in the process of doing what S Group has already done. So I'm listening very intrigued to all the actions that has been taken already. Systembolaget is one of those companies that for most people in Sweden, it doesn't need any further introduction, and I will not be very long on this, given also that we have a little bit of a time constraint. But I think one of the things that is important to know about us that a lot of people do not know is the fact that given that we are a state-owned monopoly within the EU framework, is that we are not allowed to source directly from producers now in our supply chain. So that means that we always have a Swedish importer in between us and the producers that produce our products. So in practice, that means that we have roughly 700 Swedish importers that are helping us in supplying the 16,000 products that we have in our assortments. And I want you to just keep those numbers in mind as we go along, to sort of understand the challenges that they're facing and why the human rights impact assessments are useful. So, we're talking about supply chains, and I think it's just important to set that in a framework for what that means for Systembolaget. And because many people often have a very romantic view of a supply chain being, this beautiful hill up on a sunset, and then all the grapes that goes into this wine that you're tasting comes from that same hill. Whereas in reality, unfortunately, I have to break that down to you, is that we're seeing that there could be hundreds or even thousands of growers and producers behind just one single of those 16,000 products that I mentioned in the past. So obviously then we know that there are a lot of different entities in the supply chain, and we also know, as the different panelists already mentioned, that there are specific risks connected to the agriculture supply chains that adds even more to this complexity. And this picture illustrates, it's actually a snapshot from our sustainability platform, where we map and collect data on all the entities behind the 2,500 products that we have in our fixed assortment. And this goes out to all entities, no matter in which regions it's from. So it's from all countries. And currently we have a bit more than 4,500 different entities in the platform. So just to once again show you how big and complex the supply chains are, and for us sitting in this webinar, this is nothing new, but I just wanted to give you like the overview of what it actually looks like. We're talking about a lot of different entities, and how do you really get down to the issues behind all these entities? That's the question that we're here to discuss. So we know that we have really complex supply chains. We also now know, Systembolaget, that we have all these entities behind the products. So how do you start to begin to break that down? What we did was that we started to incorporate more of a human rights due diligence approach into all our assessments and risk analysis, etc. And I would say really the starting point was in 2018 when we had conducted human rights due diligence on our work. And the primary, there were several things in that report, but I would focus on two main points. And one of them being to try to help us identify our most salient risks. And the second part was to look at ways and sort of improvement areas for our internal procedures and processes. This picture illustrates our most salient risk, 10 of them, and I will not go into details of those risks. I mean, you can see that many of them are connected to labor rights, but there are also some in here that aren't. But what this is, or why this was useful for us, was because it helped us to not only identify risks, but also to cluster the different types of activities that we can conduct based or connected to those risks. So that could be, capacity building. It could be different ways of stakeholder engagement. It could be interactions with unions. Several different things, but by having these sort of themes, it helps you to narrow down the perspectives in terms of questions that you need to look at, but also different regions that you have to look at. So that's one of the starting points for the human rights due diligence approach. The second part of the human rights due diligence that Enact helped us with was really to try to find our improvement areas. And once again, a lot more to say than just this, but to give a very brief overview, which I think could also be useful for many others in similar situations, is that number one was that our due diligence process wasn't extensive enough, meaning that we were focused too much on only labor rights, which is common when you use the traditional social audits. Secondly, we also needed to further integrate human rights into the purchasing process and the practices, so that it becomes a very alive instrument for the whole company, really, in the work that we're doing. Thirdly, capacity building was needed both internally but also externally towards those 700 importers that I mentioned, and also all of those producers connected to our supply chain. And lastly, but I would say as important, is that our code of conduct did not sufficiently address the impact on human rights and local communities. And part of the reason of that is also because it's not specifically angled at the agriculture sector. So that was really important sort of insights for us. Okay, so now we know we have the complex supply chains. We know that they're really long. We know that there are specific risks connected to them. We also know that we as a company have improvement areas. And I think that this is where the human rights impact assessments become really useful for us as a company. It's really a tool to try to address the gaps in our processes. And you see that I put them up in the corner just to remind us of those challenges and what it is that we need to do. And I think in a way that the Italian wine industry, which is where Oxfam is conducting this human rights impact assessment, in a way is perfect for a case study. And the reason why I say that is the picture that you see to your right, or at least my right, shows all the entities in Italy. And there are almost 600 entities in Italy that is producing products in our assortment. This is also one of our biggest regions that we source from. And what we have done in the past here is that, not only are these 600 entities, speaks to what I said before, and also what Tim mentioned, it's extremely difficult to actually check all of those entities, and question is, even if you did, would it be useful? But we have done over 150 audits and producer visits in Italy ourselves, and using third-party auditors. And what we have seen there, once again, only confirms what we know, is that the risks are the biggest on farm level. But the problem is that it's really difficult to actually reach beyond tier 2 and 3, to actually get down, all the way to where the grapes are grown. And by knowing that, we also know that it's not sufficient to use only audits for these issues. So what with that background, I think that the human rights impact assessment has really is providing a different concept, a different tool. And in terms of expectations, as we still have not received the final report, I guess the expectations to Tim and the team, no pressure, is really, we're seeing that this is a great way for us to receive even better feedback on our work, both in terms of on how we can improve, but I think it's more important so that this feedback comes directly from those rights holders that are affected, that we can bypass this really long supply chain and the complexity and get right to the issues and the people affected. This really helps us to improve, I think, going forward. So that's number one. Secondly, the benefit of, instead of doing these 600 potential entities checks that we would have to do, this gives us a way of having insight to industry and regional challenges. And given that we are one of the biggest buyers of wine in the world, this allows us to actually create a different type of dialogue with different stakeholders on the ground to try to address these issues on a more systemic ground. And lastly, I think maybe the most important part of this, I would say, is that the human rights impact assessment, as has been mentioned by all the other panelists, but I really want to emphasize this, is that it is a multi-stakeholder sort of initiative, and it really brings different actors together. And by doing that, you get the insights and the knowledge from the local NGOs, the local unions, which have all the ears and eyes on the ground. You combine that with the expertise of organizations like Oxfam, and then you add the leverage of a company to really try to address these issues. And I think that that's the beauty of the human rights impact assessment that you don't get in, for instance, social audits and other issues. So I think that that's really what we're hoping to do with this. As I said, we haven't seen the end, but that's the ambition going forward with this for us. So thank you.
Great, thanks a lot to all the speakers. And if you can all turn on your microphone, Jean-René, Nina, Tim, and we'll open up for questions from the audience. Firstly, brief reflection from me, being the auditing expert in the, I feel a bit like the skunk at the party. Everyone singing praise of the human rights impact assessment, and me having spent most of my working life with audits. But what I find a challenge with audits and working with audits is that you end up with a corrective action plan. So you actually don't solve the problem. You have a long to-do list of what needs to be improved. You actually don't improve anything. And with human rights impact assessment, you actually get an even longer list of things to do, like addressing root causes from policy, government. It's almost a bit intimidating. So, I was wondering, like, to what extent do you think that human rights impact assessment to-do list, if I can call it that, puts you in a better position to actually change things than the conventional corrective action plan, which is also a long to-do list. Because in the end, the proof that we have succeeded is change on the ground. Anyone is free to comment.
Maybe I can start. I think that what you are asking, Henrik, is a very relevant question, and of course, to be honest, it might be exhausting also to see the to-do list after the impact assessment carried out. But I think that you have a point there, because one of the key topics that I have learned also in my previous work, working very closely with the cocoa farmers, is to try to understand the root causes and being able to see that the change what you can do. And even though if we would, I would say, follow the UNGPs and the company responsibilities very thoroughly, you would probably or you could end up in the situation that you say, okay, this is not my responsibility, I will not do it because it's not kind of requested from us. But when you kind of find the reasons, and you can make the change, and it can be also something that you can do, and you can see what kind of impacts it has on the ground, and for example for the community, so for the farmers, it's also very rewarding in that sense. That I feel that this impact assessment also kind of helps you to understand that there are things that you can correct. Maybe it's too harsh to say easily, but they are not too overcomplicated to kind of correct. At the same time, you can also find that there are reasons, and there are kind of the root causes that you don't, it's very hard for you to have then the real impact, that you can't correct everything. But then you can of course then use the leverage, and I think also these type of discussions are helpful for that, so that we can understand, like Tim was explaining. But maybe this is my personal experience is more or less like this.
I'll just add something to that, Henrik, if I may. I think so your typical corrective action plan from an audit, most of it is focused on the supplier, right? What do they need to do differently in order, to continue to supply you as a company. And the big difference with the impact assessment approach is that it should be looking, in a more objective way at what everybody needs to do, and at considering more these structural root causes. So rather than sort of a finger pointing approach of saying, you're the problem, you're the bad apple in the barrel, to a particular supplier, it's accepting that we all, all actors in the chain have a role to play. You're all part of the solutions that are needed, and everybody has actions that they can take, including, yourself as a company. Now that's a very different framing. And I think that can help. If you can communicate that well to suppliers, that can open up a totally different type of relationship. It's not easy. And I think, and Hanna will say this as well, in many other contexts, we found it quite difficult to broker those types of conversations with suppliers. But I think it will get easier as this type of approach becomes more commonplace, because of course, suppliers have been absolutely conditioned to be afraid, of sustainability issues. They're afraid to talk out about it because it's seen as a compliance issue. If they acknowledge any problems in their supply chain, they get cut out. We all know there's lots of, it's widely documented, not just by Oxfam, by many others as well. So we've got to get beyond that type of compliance mindset to, a more collaborative approach to understanding root causes and what everyone needs to do. And the other thing that I think it makes a big difference for the company that may have commissioned the impact assessment, and we saw this really clearly with S Group, I think we're seeing it with Systembolaget and in other contexts, what it really helps the company to do is to break down the barriers between sustainability teams and commercial teams. And that's the barrier that needs to be broken down to get to the root causes of many of these problems. And so this, these processes give you a vehicle. If you're a sustainability or a human rights person in your company, one of these processes gives you a framework in which you can break down that barrier. You can start the dialogue. facilitated basically by an independent actor like an Oxfam or whoever else is running the process, you know, it can give you that space to have those difficult conversations and bring you on that journey, and then you have a basis to kind of continue that. So it's, you know, it's taking these issues out of the box of sustainability and out of a pure focus just on what's wrong with the supplier. It's giving that bigger perspective and a framework in which you can have more effective conversations across your company. And so that, you know, that's how you can get to more sort of transformative change, I hope.
No, I think that's also from anyone who has been discussing a collective action plan with a factory, you know, like when you come to a point and you ask the supplier, what can we do to help you with this? And you get immediately a more constructive dialogue. If you can frame that further, looking at a much broader picture, I think that's a really good approach. We've had
sorry, Henrik, can I just add to that, to the comment?
Sure.
I would sort of challenge a little bit on the time perspective that you mentioned, you know, in terms of that social audits is what we have done in the past and whether or not it's scalable to do human rights impact assessments. I would just say that given the experience that we have from trying to plan and actually conduct audits within the agriculture sector, when you involve, you know, sort of the producer and then the grower levels, the time that it takes just to sort of plan those audits and then afterwards also receive the remediation plans, ensure that there is practices in place afterwards, not only at producer level, but once again, going beyond the tier 1. I haven't actually broken down the numbers, but I'm tempted to say that it might take about as long a time. So just a little bit perspective on that, even though it can feel like a daunting task. I think that there's room for both.
We don't have a lot of time left, but I do wanted to get a word with Jean-René as well, because I think there's been some questions raised in the chat about the reliability of the data, and I think it's your trade union has been one of the stakeholders interviewed, so through you being able to access information straight from the workers, which is very impressive, and especially considering this is a industry where you have a lot of migrant workers, temporary workers. So it would be interesting to hear a bit more about you know, your work with unionization and your contact with the workers in this area where you usually have low level of unionization and difficulties in reaching out to workers and organizing them.
Well, being a labor union, we sometimes we feel alone, no? We feel in a kind of loneliness in this fight against, in this fight for human rights in the agricultural sector. We should consider one thing. Now there is a very specific root and cause of this the current situation, and the root is due to the migration policy we have in most European countries. We have a kind of trend to ostracism towards migrants, and migrants are forced to live in very, very miserable conditions. The legislation at the national levels force them to live in marginalized conditions. And we believe, you know, being a labor union, we don't consider workers, we don't divide workers into nationals and foreigners. For a labor union, workers are workers, no, regardless of their origin, regardless of the place they come from. But if we have these these laws now that force people to ostracism, they have to survive one way or the other. And in some cases, in most cases, the employers take advantage of that conditions. Now they live in. Let me take one example, just a few seconds. Now there is a very large company, tomato processing company, in the area of Foggia, southern Italy, Apulia region, that in the past didn't really look into the issue of human rights, but with time, they open up, and now they have turned to be a very good example, because they look at every step, every stage of the process, from their suppliers to the tomato processing issue in their company, and that is a great change. Now, it is a great change, and nobody says other companies cannot do the same thing. Now, Doria, Multi, most of the company can do the same thing, but they are not really interested because they believe that it is not their responsibility to do that. They are free to agree in doing that or not, but we believe they have to. They have to do that. Human rights go beyond the financial interest and the financial assets. We have to look properly at human rights, and we have to consider that migrants and the women's conditions are very fragile in agriculture. We have to look very deeply into that, because women are exposed to exploitative labor, but at the same time they are also exposed to sexual violence. We shouldn't forget that. We have to keep that in mind. That's why this is a great battle. That's we should join our forces in tackling this issue.
Thanks. I think it's been it's great asset when you do this kinds of studies to actually have these contacts on the ground and have an established trade union there. A lot of the markets you don't have that access. So I'd like to thank all of you. Unfortunately, we have to end this session now. Thanks a lot to all of the panelists who've been here during the day. Really interesting. If you want to share this with someone, we will present this as a recording on our homepage, so you can access it. So if you know anyone who would benefit from hearing this, please share it with them. And I also like to tell you about the introductory course to human rights due diligence that we'll have on the 17th of December, that you're all welcome to. We'll do that in cooperation with EGI Norway. And for those of you interested in the report by Oxfam, here is a link to the report. I think it's also been sent out in the chat. And also the contact to the person at Oxfam who is their contact person for company. What's that? And of course, if you want to contact us for any reason, you also have my contact details there. So thanks a lot to everyone who listened in, and of course, thanks a lot to all the panelists again. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Henrik.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye. Bye.